Yes, well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. It really is, and it's wonderful to be with all of you here. We're going to have a great several days. Well, I'd just like to say a couple of things. I was very much aware of the fact that Dwight Eisenhower, my grandfather, brought the greats from World War II here to Gettysburg. We had everyone from Winston Churchill to Charles de Gaulle, who was General de Gaulle during the war and later President de Gaulle, and actually even Konrad Adenauer, who was the first Chancellor of New Germany, if we can call it that. And so it was, Gettysburg was a gathering point for that as well. Now I have to say that I have a year-long strategy seminar at Gettysburg College at the Eisenhower Institute, and I just came back from Normandy, where I took 6 of my students. You know, that war is still alive everywhere. A week before we arrived, a young child had been injured by pulling on something, and it turned out to be a mine, some kind of one of the defensive mines that they had there on the beach. And the week before we arrived, they found a bomb near Gare du Nord in Paris and had to shut down half the city. So I asked the locals, how long is it going to take to really clear the Normandy coast, for instance, from the unexploded ordnance and other things brought about by this war? They said another 60 years. And so I think it's sort of over for us, but it still lives in Europe. It's still, and the legacy of the war in Europe, and later we'll have the end of the war in Japan, is still with those who live in those areas. So I think it's up to all of us to try and make sure that America is fully aware of the consequences of this war and what we fought for.
Amen.
You don't mind. Did your father have a sense, or grandfather have a sense of how he was portrayed? He was the person in the room, so to speak, in movies, in films, and how did he respond to that?
Well, for, a couple of things on this. First of all, he famously said to his headquarters diarist, Harry Butcher, Captain Butcher, you don't have to make me part of this. You don't have to make me the lead in this story. Go out and interview people at all echelons of the fight, because people at home want to know what their loved ones are doing. And so sometimes during certain periods, he has sort of slightly disappeared, and then he reemerges. I think he has definitely reemerged from everything I can see, because I think the world is hungry to understand something about the leadership that made such a complicated set of operations possible. This is the first time in military history that one man had commanded land, sea, and air, and also a multinational coalition. And so the complexities of that were extraordinary, the decisions extremely difficult, and we're now gaining a greater appreciation as we're in a period of uncertainty about what it means to actually make decisions under those conditions. I'll say one more thing precisely to that point. A number of movies came out about World War II in his retirement. My brother David and I were in the back room watching them all, and Granddad wasn't. He was worrying about the future.
Yeah. That's interesting. How important is it for us to sort of revisit our history through film, even as we're going through what were the chaos, the division right now? And any one of you can answer, if you want to answer that. How significant are these historical films now?
Well, I think particularly as we are entering the age of AI, and what is true and what is not true is becoming much more difficult to ascertain. The facts we see there's a less reliance on facts, that it might be possible to say that up is down and down is up, that, you know, it's winter's warm and summer's cold. There's a wholesale sort of assault on that, and I think what everyone at this table has been engaged in their lives in various forms and very interesting forms, is how you approach the collection of history, and in my case, how you create an environment where you can permit lots of different perspectives on what happened, but no alternative facts. Patrick Moynihan is famous for saying, the senator from New York was famous for saying, you're entitled to your own opinions, but not to your own set of facts. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately today, that's almost been reversed, and that is a kind of symbol of where we are, that you're sort of allowed to create your own set of alternative facts, and you're not allowed to have opinions. And that is a scary sort of thing, and runs counter to what Susan's grandfather was trying to do in terms of and what actually was achieved by the war. So, for example, in the film that I'm thinking about most on American Revolution, we are able to contain a wide variety of complex sort of viewpoints and scholarly stuff. It's all based on fact. Nobody's making anything up, but some person may say, despite his flaws, despite his rashness on the battlefield, and he would run into battle all the time, ignoring the bullets whizzing by him, could have been killed many, many times. And besides bad military decisions in a couple of very notable cases, Long Island and Brandywine, there's no one more important to the survival and the existence of the United States than George Washington. So you can contain all of that stuff. You can understand that. Unfortunately, we live in an age sometimes when revisionism on both sides cancels somebody out. So, you did this, so you're no longer valuable. Or, you did that, you're no longer valuable. And what I think good history does, and Jeff knows this too, it's an element of fiction. Yeats, I believe it was, commenting on William Shakespeare, said that Shakespeare had negative capability. That was the ability to hold in tension somebody's great strengths and their great flaws at the same time, and not force you to make a decision or not make your own decision about it. And I think the way you handle history is exactly that way, in which you have that negative capability. You can look at somebody and understand, say, for example, they enslaved other human beings, or that they were this, and you give an opportunity to do that. It's the way we can't be married unless you do that. You can't have children unless you do that. You can't have friends unless you do that. But somehow in our politics, it's all a binary. It's always an on or an off switch, and there's nothing in nature that is that binary. And so I think the good storytelling, the good history making, the extraordinary performances, the fiction, all issue from an ability to tolerate these complexities and to be able to create environments where you can allow a variety of perspectives to obtain.
So I have a question actually for Martin, similar to that. At a time when movies were coming out like Patton and The Longest Day and all these incredible movies that were portraying the heroism of World War II, you chose to portray Eddie Slovik.
Yeah,
a very different story that goes right along with that.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you think that was an important story to tell?
Well, for me, it was at the time we did it, I believe it was in 1972 or 3, was a plea to end the death penalty. And the general belief was that it was a deterrent to crime, but as long as you didn't have to see it. And even the soldiers that were ordered to participate knew there was only one round in one of those guns, so that they all had a feeling of reserve and not carry the weight of it, because it really destroyed the morale of the community at the time. And your grandfather canceled the next one as a result. As you know, there was a guy right behind Eddie Slovik that was ready for execution and who had really deserted. And it was a question of, the mother that begged President Lincoln to spare her son. And he spoke of justice, and she said, I'm not asking for justice. I'm asking for mercy. I think that's what it is. We're required to seek justice and love mercy and walk humbly.
Micah 6:8.
Yeah, so what is that from?
Micah 6:8 in the Bible, Old Testament.
I knew it was from the book. I wasn't sure which testament, but it's good enough to be in both.
Wow.
But that was
very quick.
But that was the main focus of our production, was to say at this time and in this environment, where there was wholesale executions in practically every state, that maybe we should pause and think about this, because there were so many people being executed who were later proven innocent, and the state of Illinois was really the first one to put a stamp on it when the governor at that time outlawed executions during his tenure.
So you're using a historical story, a true story, but
Yeah.
to tell a more important story. Really.
Yeah, it was about, we couldn't do anything about what happened then, but if it evokes a mercy, if it evokes some measure of compassion, if you have an opportunity to go back and say, if I had made a choice, would I have just deferred for a while, given him a stay? Maybe the war would end in a few months, and maybe it'd been a different outcome. So that's what we're asking for: is mercy, compassion, because we're capable of it. Even in the most dire circumstances. That's a part of our humanity that is not exemplified much these days in certain quarters.
So in 2025, as we sit here today, why is it important to, I have teenage sons who weren't around when this movie was made. Why now? Why do we reflect now? Why have the Gettysburg Film Festival to look at these pieces?
Oh my, we'd be listening to what this gentleman and this lady just said.
I'm asking you now.
I can't even come close to the level of involvement that Ken has done with our industry. I'm very proud to be a part of this. However, as a personal, but as a fan, as a member of his audience, I've just been. The only problem we had with watching the week of the Civil War is that it ended every night, and we had to wait for the following night. And the audience grew and grew and grew. And it's being rerun in so many PBS stations across the country now as we speak, and as we get close to these anniversaries of great, conflicts being resolved. And another thing about Gettysburg that just, I was here, I played a certain general who shall not be remembered. No, with all due respect. And I learned a great deal about what happened here and what they did here and what he said here, which I'm going to focus a little bit on tonight when I get the pleasure of introducing Ken at tonight's presentation. But I was very moved by President Carter, who brought Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin here when they were at Camp David trying to resolve differences. And one thing that happened here, in his book, as soon as he left office, he wrote a book called Keeping Faith, and he talks a great deal about that effort. And it took a lot of his foreign policy time and effort, was the peace in the Middle East, and with those two guys. And when he brought them here, he asked both of them, what about your grandchildren, stuff like that. I said, you have grand, and they both, they were very anxious. I think Begin pulled out some pictures and showed his and he said, as a leader, what kind of future are you going to offer them? We have 54,000 able-bodied young men died here, because of an idea, and that in the future that we hold sacred now, we sacrificed here. And so would you want your grandchildren to have to go through that, or don't you possess the vision to see in the future that you could make their lives a little bit more peaceful and give them an opportunity to find an alternative? And look what's happening today. And that section of, incidentally, at the bottom of Gaza, right where it touches Egypt, that half-a-mile section was negotiated by Jimmy Carter and Menachem Begin and Sadat here in Gettysburg. Yeah. And it became as you know, during the horrible, brutal war that's still going on, a great refuge. But it was a spot where kids flew kites. At any rate, just that. And I'm getting ready to, I'm not announcing something here, but it's true. I'm preparing to do a book that has not been published yet. I'm going to do the, what do you call it, book on tape? Or audio book. A book called The Ghosts of Hiroshima. And it is the story, and James Cameron is planning a movie on the Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And there's quotes in the book of people who were alive and were engaged in world affairs and all this thing. And one of them was your grandfather, who is quoted in the book as saying, "I can't believe that they used that awful thing on people." There's something that I paraphrase.
It's interesting how many of the uniformed military were against the use of that bomb. Yeah.
So everything is coming full circle, you know. As long as we can't find or can't seem to find those better angels that are still stumbling around in
Amen.
our inner life,
Amen.
we're going to stumble into each other, you know.
I have a quick question, if I may. Justin, with the American Battlefield Trust. First of all, I'm grateful to be here with you all. Thank you for being here. Jeff, Martin, maybe, what's your process in manifesting a character, whether it be World War II era, Civil War era, or other?
Well, there are two kinds of characters. There's the historical character, which you're putting words in the mouth of somebody who's well known, and you've got to get the words right because people care. And then there's the fictitious character, who you can sort of do anything you want. In my case, I try to blend that. I try to blend the two together where you can't tell. You know, the idea that this, you know, George Washington, you know, could have said this, could have said this. We don't know that he did. We'll never know. But if that blends into the story, then it works. The story works. And if you can combine that with the totally fictitious character and have their dialogue or their interactions mesh very smoothly, the story works. And that's my goal in everything I've done, is to exactly that. I just want to very quickly. I just want to say something that tagged on to what Susan said, when she's talking about the fact that Ike was commander of everything, you know, command air, sea, and land, and so forth. That's a double-edged sword,
Right.
because you're responsible. You know, if you win, that's great. You win. If you lose, and Ike, right prior, the night before D-Day, Ike wrote a letter, and this is all true, and I'm sure she can back this up, wrote a letter to the press, basically, folded the letter up, stuck it in his pocket. The letter said, "I am so sorry. You know, this is all my responsibility. You know, this disaster is totally on me," because no one knew what was going to happen when the soldiers hit the beach. They might have been thrown right back into the water. I mean, the Germans had a pretty formidable defensive line there, and I accepted that as his responsibility. That's pretty cool. I mean, for a guy to take that responsibility, and of course, as it turns out, he wins. You know, he was right. But it could have gone the other way. And I love that, taking responsibility for what you're doing, which is something else. We were talking about what's missing today. Maybe that's something else that's missing today.
And General Lee here did the same thing, Jeff. After the third day at Gettysburg, it is all my fault. It is all my fault, and offered his surrender offered his resignation to Jefferson Davis, who who refused it because there was nobody like that willing to accept the responsibility.
Yeah.
So you can tell that these stories have such an enduring quality. And I think that's really important, especially for rising generations, because we don't teach it very much anymore. And you know, this is really an enormous gap that has to be filled, I think.
Maybe to go back to your question about your sons, you know, and Eddie Slovak, is that, and maybe to bring in the Bible once again in Ecclesiastes, which is the Old Testament, you know, what has been will be again, what has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun. That suggests that human nature doesn't change. And while we like to say that history repeats itself, it never does. No event has ever happened twice, but we do see the patterns. Mark Twain is supposed to have said history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And all of us here are painfully aware of the rhymes that are present throughout the story of at least American history. And so if you know that history, then you are better armed. It's the greatest teacher we have. You're better armed to know not only where we've been, but where we are and where we may be going. So it is incumbent, obviously, for your sons to know a little bit about what happened 80 years ago and 81 years ago, but also what happened to Private Eddie Slovak in his story, and all of those are part of the mosaic that make you a much better citizen. Because that's what the United States did for the first time in human history. For the first time in human history, everybody before us were subjects, right? And after that, we were citizens, and that required virtue, and the way you got virtue was through continuing education. That's called the pursuit of happiness. They didn't mean the acquisition of objects in a marketplace of things. They meant lifelong learning in a marketplace of ideas. They would all say that. That's what it's about. So history is the best possible teacher we have.
Do you ever envision?
No, I just wanted to add to that again. I'm very interested in figuring out what part of this story says something to rising generations. The thing that's so extraordinary about the complexity of our effort in Europe and ultimately Japan, it was all done without computers. Right. Mm-hmm. I've been down into the tunnels. There's a tunnel near headquarters in Portsmouth, England, yes, where the signals came across, a signal pipeline was laid, and the signals were coming back in, but this was all done without computer. And it goes to show what the human mind can do when it's actually working on its own. Sorry for, sorry for.
No, that's good.
I want to say, just sort of put a plug in for the film festival, since there's sort of a question, why, why are we here? We're all here because there's a film festival being put on, and people come to Gettysburg, usually, almost always. You stop somebody with an out-of-state license plate and you ask them, why are you here? And it's almost always because they're here about the Battle of Gettysburg, logically enough. But I think what this festival is doing is it's bringing people into town and bringing people whose total involvement is not just Battle of Gettysburg, not just the Civil War, it's history. And the importance of history and the importance of people, of characters. What is Robert E. Lee really like? What is George Meade really like? So you've got, those are the questions about Gettysburg. But what this festival is doing, I think, by bringing films that have, not been shown in decades, or unknown to younger generations, is educate them a little bit. And one thing, I remember Ted Turner saying this: if you can entertain people by educating them, they don't even know they're being educated. That's right. And I think that's a really good point. You bring young people to some of these films, and they have a whole different perspective. Their whole outlook changes on what's going on here. So I think that festival, the idea of the festival, it's not just, a Gettysburg Film Festival, we're going to talk about Gettysburg. No, we're talking about a whole lot of other things. I think that's fabulous.
How do you think this moment now, because you are a filmmaker, what's it going to look like when 10, 20 years more they tell this story right now? Do you ever think, what's that going to look like?
Yeah, you know what, I hide behind history for questions like that because we require, Philip Graham, who used to own the Washington Post, said, journalism is the first rough draft of history, which is a wonderful phrase until you stop and think no one turns in a rough draft, right? But you turn in a rough draft every single day. And so those of us who are engaged in history in some fashion or another, storytelling, we require the passage of time. We need the perspective that comes from a variety of journalistic perspectives, followed by scholarly pursuits, followed by subsequent scholarly pursuits to triangulate in the best sense of the word. I made a film on the Vietnam War, right? We were just last week on the 30th anniversary of the fall of Saigon in '75. So what if I had made that film 10 years after, in 85, right? The United States was in a recession. We talked about the Pacific Rim, but that meant that Japan was dominant now, and we were receding in importance, the American thing, and that Vietnam would be this ball and chain that would be the symbol of our decline, right? What if I'd waited 20 years to 1995? We're in the middle of the largest peacetime economic expansion. We are the sole lone superpower in the world. We have just won the first Gulf War with a coalition that put it together. Vietnam would have, obviously it's important, lives were lost, but it would no longer be some sort of cloud raining on the American Republic experience. What if I waited 30 years until 2005 when we were bogged down in Afghanistan and Iraq? People are using Vietnam analogies. Now, did the Vietnam War change in any way? No. Right? But the perception did, the mountaintop from which we were watching it. So the farther away you get, the better chance you have to have a perspective, to benefit from new scholarship that can connect some of the dots that are maybe missing in the rough draft and be able to make comments on it. But we ask this question because we know that so many of the things that we sort of assume and take for granted about the American narrative are being challenged, if not undermined, right now. And so there's a great deal of anxiety to come to some conclusion about it. And unfortunately, we actually just have to wait and see. And obviously try to manifest, as this film festival does, the values that have defined us since our beginning. I mean, let's just remember, I'm finishing a film on on the American Revolution, whose heart is, of course, the Declaration of Independence at the end of our second episode, which is entitled, following common sense, An Asylum for Mankind. Right? We're actually, something is new under the sun, which is the United States, the experiment of the United States. But it's here that we get the 2.0, because the guy who wrote the 1.0 owned other human beings and didn't see the hypocrisy or the contradiction, or didn't see fit in his lifetime to free most of those people. And the guy who came here to dedicate the battlefield said, we really do believe this, and we will double down on this. So we are reinvented. We have, literally as he said, a new birth of freedom. But how long does it take? 77 years for him to be able to declare a 2.0.
Are you saying we need gaps of history? We need to have that buffer as we tell our stories? We shouldn't tell it too soon?
No. I think we have to have, we've known, and one of the reasons why we were found is that we wanted to have a free press, somebody that's commenting, a vigorous discussion in which we listen to lots of points of view. I live in a tiny town in New Hampshire, and in the Revolution, it had a newspaper, one of dozens of newspapers that were circulated and read all throughout the colonies. So the Walpole Gazette was read in Georgia, and whatever opinions were there were different, and New Hampshire and Georgia were like two different countries. The idea that they came together as two of the 13 colonies is itself phenomenal. So no, we have to have that robust thing, but to be able to stick a flag and say, I understand exactly what's going on now, is going to take some time.
It's the perception of it.
Yeah.
I think is what you're saying. I have one last question. I will finish up here.
Yeah, I think we have to cut it off,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Your
We can make
thoughts
this
about
brief. Thank
the
you.
threat of PBS, the threat that PBS is under right now?
So
Very concerned?
very concerned. This has always been a concern. There have been people that have wanted to do it. This is probably the most sort of determined assault on it, but it's sort of misguided. I made a film on the national parks called whose subtitle was America's Best Idea. That's what Wallace Stegner had said about the parks. It's not. The best idea is in the Declaration of Independence. But once you've created that, you could say that the national parks were the declaration applied to the landscape. For the first time in human history, land was set aside not for the wealthy, not for kings, not for royalty, but for everybody and for all time, right? Public television is essentially the Declaration of Independence applied to this. It's not in the marketplace, right? It has one foot tentatively in the marketplace and the other proudly out. There's 350 stations. That's the largest network in the country. And it actually benefits people in rural areas more than it does people in urban areas. And so while the complaint is that it is somehow an advocate for the opinions of the Upper West Side or Nob Hill or Georgetown, it is in fact Cookeville, Tennessee, in eastern Tennessee, the station I visited, that has the benefits not only of our childhood education stuff, but our primetime schedule, continuing education, classrooms of the air, weather, crop reports, homeland security stuff. That's the thing that is most threatened. PBS nationally will survive because about 15% of its budget comes from that. Most of the budget of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting goes to those individual stations. And they are often the only local news that is local to that area, that knows, that goes to the school board, that goes to the zoning board meeting, that understands what it is at the bottom. So it's an incredibly short-sighted thing, unless you want subjects, superstitious peasantry, instead of citizens.
Thank you, everyone, so much. If media folks could exit through the back, we'll have our guests.